Today, Airbnb is a juggernaut valued around $80 billion. Since launch, they've welcomed over 2 billion guests and built a bigger inventory than Marriott, Hilton, and Intercontinental combined. And we're not just talking hotel rooms. You can book a castle in Europe, a private island in the Caribbean, a houseboat, or, if you're feeling adventurous, an igloo. And it's not like these places are just sitting there empty. In fact, as of right now, 6 people are checking into Airbnb every single second. At one point, the platform moves so much money that their annual bookings rival the entire GDP of Croatia. Looking at it now, it's a pretty brilliant app. One that disrupted the travel industry, created new markets, and yes, spawned problems nobody saw coming. But in 2007, the idea that any of this would work didn't just seem unlikely, it seemed laughable. Because this isn't a story about geniuses or even a disruptive success right out of the gate. It's about constant rejection, desperate pivots, and the guts to make the hard calls. This is the story of Airbnb and how 3 guys who should have failed didn't. In high school, Brian Chesky picked a senior quote that was, let's just say, not exactly ambitious. It was a bit of self-deprecating humor, inspired by Jerry Seinfeld, and he actually got in trouble with his dad for that one. For someone who would eventually run $1 billion company, reading that now sounds completely unexpected. But it just goes to show that he didn't take himself too seriously back then. You see, Brian didn't grow up coding in his garage or dreaming about startups. He'd watch old Walt Disney videos from the 60s on repeat, obsessed with this idea that you could design entire worlds. He was an artist, and a compulsive one at that. He'd go through hundreds and hundreds of pages drawing constantly. He drew so much that by age 10 he could draw like an adult, and by high school he could draw like a professional artist. So naturally, he followed that passion to the Rhode Island School of Design. His parents supported him, but at the same time, they were worried. They were social workers, and they knew what it meant to choose passion over paychecks. In their eyes, art school was choosing the one career path that paid even less than a social worker. Their grand ambition for Brian was simple: get a stable job, and hopefully one with health insurance. So after graduation, Brian tried to do the responsible thing. By 2007, at 26 years old, he was working as an industrial designer in Los Angeles. He had a salary, he had health insurance, and he had the safe life his parents wanted. But he was miserable. He felt trapped in a loop, staring down a future that looked exactly like his past. So in an impulsive moment, he finally gave in to his old college roommate, Joe Gebbia. Joe had been pitching him for months on the same wild idea: move to San Francisco and start a business together. Brian quit his job, packed his life into his car, and drove straight to San Francisco. He only had $1,000 in the bank, but he was excited about running his own business. He didn't know it yet, but he was driving straight into a financial cliff. Because in San Francisco, $1,000 doesn't get you a dream. It doesn't even get you rent. When Brian arrived in San Francisco, he quickly found out the reality he was in. He was unemployed, and the only money in his name wasn't even enough to pay for rent. He had $1,000 in the bank, and his share of the rent was $1,150. He literally couldn't afford to sleep in his own apartment. But, as luck would have it, they spotted an opportunity. The Industrial Designers Society of America was holding a massive conference in the city, and every hotel was fully booked. That's when Joe had a brilliant idea. What if they offered a place to stay for the people who couldn't book a room? Now, they didn't have extra beds, but they had extra space. And they had 3 air mattresses. The plan was simple: blow up the mattresses, serve the guests breakfast, and earn a little money to keep the landlord away. So they quickly put up a simple website and reached out to a couple of local design bloggers to get the word out. and they called it Airbed and Breakfast. They honestly didn't know if anyone would be crazy enough to sleep in a stranger's apartment. And yet, people showed up. 3 of them, in fact. A 35-year-old woman, a father from Utah, and a man from India. And they didn't just sleep there. They hung out, they talked, and they even went to the conference together. Heck, one of them, the man from India, even invited them to his wedding 2 years later. By the end of that weekend, they had enough money for rent. But more than anything, this wasn't just about making rent. This was about connection, and maybe it was about helping people feel at home anywhere. They had just touched the very soul of what their company would one day become. But unfortunately, they didn't recognize it at the time. To them, this was just a way to buy time while they thought of the big idea. So they talked themselves out of it, packed the mattresses away, and spent the next 4 months building what they thought was the real business. Brian and Joe spent the next 4 months building what they thought was the real business, a roommate matching website. Unlike the scrappy weekend hack they'd pulled off to pay rent, this felt like a legitimate startup idea. It was safe, it was logical, and, well, it was a complete failure. After months of work, they discovered that roommates.com already existed. Not just as an idea, but as a fully functioning website that had been operating for years. In other words, they had burned through 4 months and most of their money on something that wasn't even innovative. So they pivoted back to the only thing that had ever made them money, the weird air mattress idea. They brought in their old roommate, Nathan Blecharczyk, a brilliant engineer who could build the platform for real. And this time, they were going to do it right. Not as a desperate rent hack, but as a legitimate business. Their logic was simple. If they could convince 3 people to stay in a stranger's house on an impromptu weekend, surely they could get more people with a proper website and a real launch strategy. Right? So they aimed for the biggest stage they could find. South by Southwest in Austin, Texas. Now SXSW is famous for music, but in the tech world, this was the exact place where Twitter had launched just a year earlier and become a global phenomenon. Basically, it was the Super Bowl for startups. So they launched the site and hoped for their Twitter moment. But on launch day, they got 2 bookings, and one of them was Brian. After the SXSW failure, they knew that just having a website wasn't enough. They realized they needed money to build a real platform and get some visibility. So in the summer of 2008, they tried to raise $150,000 at a $1.5 million valuation and reached out to angel investors. They were offering 10% of the company for $150,000. Today, that stake would be worth billions. But back then, they couldn't even get a single investor to say yes. They reached out to about 15 angel investors. More than half didn't even reply, and the rest said no. To them, the vision was too risky, too niche, or just weird. One investor even met Brian at a cafe, ordered a smoothie, and walked out in the middle of the pitch. That's how crazy he thought the idea was. So, with no investors willing to bet on them, they had to fund the company themselves. They entered what they jokingly called the Visa round. Instead of a round of investors, they were just racking up credit card debt. They even kept a binder to store all their maxed out cards, sliding each one into a plastic sleeve like baseball cards. Then, in August 2008, a glimmer of hope appeared. The Democratic National Convention was coming to Denver. It had the same perfect conditions as that weekend in San Francisco. A massive event, booked out hotels and lots of visitors with nowhere to stay. So they announced another launch. In fact, their 3rd at this point. But who's counting? And this time, it actually worked. They got 80 bookings in a single week. And for the first time in a long while, it felt like they'd finally broken through. But the week after the convention ended, their traffic dropped to almost zero. As it turned out, people only used the site for that one massive event. And unless there was a big convention every single week, this wasn't sustainable. Renting out airbeds just wasn't working, so they got to thinking, maybe they should focus on the breakfast part instead. In the fall of 2008, desperate and out of options, they stopped working on their website and started hand-folding cereal boxes instead. They bought hundreds of boxes of generic cereal from the grocery store, then hot-glued the custom packaging together in their kitchen. They designed Obama O's and Captain McCain's, marketed them as limited edition, and sold them for $40 a box. And instead of just emailing reporters, they mailed the actual boxes directly to journalists. They figured if a reporter received the box, they'd want to know where it came from, and they'd want to hear the story. It was an absurd, desperate attempt, but at the same time, it was genius. They got featured on CNN, sold hundreds of boxes, and made about $30,000. Enough to pay off their debts, but as you might have guessed, as soon as the election ended, the hype died. Sure, they managed to get out of debt, but they were still broke. They were so broke that they were literally eating the unsold cereal just to get by. But you know what? That crazy cereal stunt had done more than just pay the bills. It gave them a story. And it gave them the courage to knock on one last door. By late 2008, they'd finally paid off the credit cards, but the business wasn't growing. And without growth, they were headed straight back into debt. What they needed was a reality check. And they got it from Michael Seibel, one of the founders of Justin.tv, the startup that would eventually become Twitch. He looked at their numbers and was brutally honest. The company was dying and they needed help fast, so he recommended them to Y Combinator. For context, Y Combinator was one of the most prestigious startup accelerators in Silicon Valley. If you got in, you'd get funding, mentorship, and most importantly, credibility. This was it. A real chance to dig themselves out of this hole. So they took a breath, pulled themselves together, and secured a meeting with Y Combinator's founder, Paul Graham. But almost immediately, the meeting went south. He thought the idea of renting out airbeds in people's living rooms was weird, dangerous, and maybe even stupid. They'd come all this way, and they were about to get rejected again. So Joe made a last-ditch move. He pulled out a box of the cereal and handed it to Graham. Graham, clearly wondering what this had to do with anything, took the box and just stared at it. So, they told him the story. How they had no money, designed the boxes themselves, hot-glued them by hand in their kitchen, and sold them for $40 each. And the fact that they'd made $30,000 selling repackaged cereal. Paul then realized if they could convince people to pay $40 for cereal, maybe they could convince people to sleep in strangers' homes. In Graham's words, they were like cockroaches. The kind of founders you just couldn't kill. Not with rejection, not with failure, not even with an empty bank account. So he accepted them into the program right then and there. Not because he believed in the idea, but because he was betting on their character. And just like that, Brian, Joe, and Nathan secured the funding. Now they have approximately 3 months to prove their idea could actually work. So they had the funding, they had the mentorship, but they didn't have the growth. And for weeks their revenue was flatlined at $200 a week. The site just wasn't appealing to potential guests at all. The photos were dark and plagued with blurry camera phone shots that made the apartments look like crime scenes. They didn't know it then, but the name Airbed and Breakfast was boxing them in. Most hosts simply wanted to rent out spare rooms or entire apartments, not just inflate a mattress. Then, Paul Graham gave them a piece of advice that changed everything. He told them to get to know their customers and win them over one by one. In other words, they had to do things that didn't scale. It went against everything Silicon Valley taught, but they listened anyway. They flew to New York, not to write code or buy ads. Instead, they rented a camera and went door to door offering free photography. They literally walked into strangers' homes and took the photos themselves. And while they were there, they listened. They realized the airbed rule was stupid, so they killed it. And to move beyond the niche concept of shared rooms and air mattresses, they rebranded to just Airbnb. This move opened the floodgates to any kind of space. Beds, rooms, even entire homes. And when they uploaded those new high-res photos, the results were immediate. Listings with professional photos booked 2 to 3 times more, and revenue started climbing. And for the first time in over a year, the numbers were finally moving. With the rebrand and the professional photos, the business was finally moving. But they needed to move faster, so they pulled off one of the most famous growth hacks in Silicon Valley history. At the time, most people looking for a place to stay was on Craigslist. So they built a bot that automatically cross-posted every Airbnb listing to Craigslist. With one click, a host could push their beautiful, high-res Airbnb listing onto the ugly, text-heavy Craigslist pages. And when users clicked those beautiful photos, they were pulled right into Airbnb. You can argue it was borderline illegal, but it worked. And they siphoned a massive wave of traffic from the giant. Craigslist eventually blocked it, but by then, Airbnb already exploded. And by 2011, bookings were skyrocketing, and they had raised over $7 million from the biggest investors in the industry. But at the same time, that explosion painted a target on their backs. In Europe, the Somewhere brothers were famous for cloning American startups. But they weren't trying to compete. They were trying to hold the market hostage until they got paid. Essentially, they would pose as a massive competitor, with the sole intention of forcing the original company to buy them out. And they had just launched a carbon copy of Airbnb called Wimdu. Now, under normal circumstances, copycats wouldn't be that big of a deal for a startup with funding. But these guys were pros at doing this. In just 30 days, they hired over 400 people, listed thousands of properties, and opened offices in every major European city. Airbnb, on the other hand, had only 40 employees and was still managing everything from San Francisco. They had a choice: buy them out and avoid the fight, or compete for dominance with only 1/10 of the resources against a clone with a massive head start. But the founders, with the help of their advisor Paul Graham, realized something fundamental. You can clone a website, but you can't clone a community. So they refused, and instead Airbnb acquired a smaller European competitor called Akaleo, expanded aggressively, and fought the Somewhere brothers market by market. The plan was simple: play the long game. So they doubled down on community, product quality, and trust, essentially just following their original vision. Wimdu, on the other hand, tried to brute force the market with massive ad spend and poaching Airbnb's hosts. But they were bleeding money in a fight they perhaps didn't fully understand. They thought they were just in the room rental business. But Airbnb understood it was also about trust. In just over a year, Airbnb dominated the market, while Wimdu slowly faded. And that victory fueled an explosion of growth across the globe. But with success came a new kind of danger, one that would test the very foundation of what they had built. By 2011, Airbnb had momentum. They'd beaten the clones, raised millions in funding, and listings were exploding across the globe. They'd come a long way since investors laughed them out of coffee shops. But then in June, a blog post went viral that nearly destroyed everything. A host known online as EJ returned to her San Francisco apartment to find it completely ransacked. Even her most personal belongings, along with her identity documents, were stolen. And when the story hit the press, almost overnight, it became a massive PR nightmare. Meanwhile, inside Airbnb, the team was split on how to respond. The standard corporate advice was to stay quiet, handle it privately, and above all, do not admit fault or you open the company to liability. But Brian understood that their entire model was built on trust. And he knew that hiding behind terms and conditions would destroy the company faster than any lawsuit. So, he did the exact opposite. He published an open letter to the entire Airbnb community, took absolute ownership, and publicly admitted that they had completely failed EJ. Then he announced something that made his finance team nervous: a $50,000 host guarantee, effective immediately and retroactively. They even expanded it to a staggering $1 million just a few months after. It was an unprecedented financial risk for the company, but it also became their greatest competitive advantage.
And I think the audacity of doing that in the early days meant that people actually, oddly enough, trusted us more after the crisis than before the crisis.
It removed the fear barrier for hosts and proved that the company stood behind its users. And in just a few years after this implementation, they reached unprecedented growth. In 2013 alone, they served more guests than they had in their entire history combined. And by 2019, they set a new record: 4 million people sleeping in an Airbnb on a single night. They were valued at over $30 billion, gearing up for one of the most anticipated IPOs in tech history. Until the spring of 2020, when the entire travel industry just stopped. In March 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic shut down the globe. Borders closed, flights were grounded, and vacations were canceled. Indefinitely. For a company whose entire business model was based on people leaving their homes, it was an apocalyptic scenario. And in just 8 weeks, Airbnb lost 80% of their business. They were bleeding hundreds of millions of dollars in guest refunds, while the media and some experts predicted the company wouldn't even survive the year. So they had to make a decision, and it wasn't an easy one. In May 2020, Airbnb decided to lay off 1,900 employees, about 25% of their workforce. Now, layoffs are inherently brutal. But in the middle of a global economic freeze, they did what they could to soften the impact. Every laid-off employee got 14 weeks of severance, kept their laptops to help with the job search, and was added to a public talent directory that Airbnb promoted to other companies. Brian even called other CEOs himself, asking them to hire his people. And to explain the decision, he wrote an honest, deeply grateful message to the people being let go.
To those leaving, I am truly sorry. Please know this is not your fault. The world will never stop seeking the qualities and talents that you brought to Airbnb that helped make Airbnb. I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for sharing them with us. Brian.
It didn't change the devastating reality of losing their jobs, but hundreds of laid-off employees actually sent thank you notes. Maybe because even in their worst professional moment, they felt valued and seen. That said, layoffs alone couldn't save the company. They still needed customers, and nobody was traveling. People weren't flying to Paris, but interestingly, they were booking cabins 2 hours from home. And because of remote work, they weren't just staying for the weekend. They were booking stays for weeks or even months at a time. Travel wasn't entirely dead, it just changed. So, in a matter of weeks, Airbnb initiated a massive company-wide pivot. They pushed local getaways instead of international travel, and they capitalized on the work-from-anywhere trend, positioning Airbnb not just for travel, but for living. And it worked. By the third quarter of 2020, while the rest of the travel industry was still on life support, Airbnb was actually turning a profit. They had taken the worst crisis in the history of travel and used it to make the company leaner, faster, and more resilient than ever before. In December 2020, just months after experts predicted their death, Airbnb went public. The stock was priced at $68 per share, and within an hour it hit $146. The company that started with 3 air mattresses on a San Francisco floor was now valued at over $100 billion. Today, Airbnb is a corporate giant like any other, facing regulatory battles, housing debates, and all the controversies that come with scale. But if nothing else, their story is proof that you don't need a perfect plan to succeed. Just the guts to keep going when things fall apart.